Hello, I am Fred Barrett, Emerging Media Learning and Development Manager here at PBS Western Reserve. Welcome to Digital Learning Day 2022. And today I will be discussing or providing insight on audio podcasting and interviewing. Now, whenever I talk about audio podcasting and interviewing, the first thing I state is that it's very easy to start a podcast. It's the quality of the podcast that's the hard part. And part of the quality of a podcast is the content, the audio quality, but primarily the interviewing. And today I want to jump straight to the interviewing. I'm going to provide a few keys to interviewing, which is the primary aspect of why audience may engage into it, to why some podcasts are more popular than others, and what have you. It's about the personality and it's about the interviewing. Without the keys to interviewing, the quality of the podcast will drop off based on the content and the quality thereof. The quality can also be the level of the audio, the clarity of the audio, but the quality is also in reference to the gauging. So once again, I want to jump straight to the keys to interviewing. So there are many benefits to a good interview in an audio podcast. And as you can see here on the slide, interviewing is the primary element in becoming a good podcast host. Without good interviewing skills, you cannot be a good podcast host. A good podcast host is a major component in attracting and maintaining listeners to your podcast. Again, a good podcast host is a major component. The content is always good to have, but the host actually carries out the content, which gathers the engagement of the audience. Your audience. Your audio podcast should benefit the listener. You should understand and relate to your audience. Later on, I will get into the aspect of you as the host are also a listener. You are a member of the same audience of the podcast, even though you're producing it. Again, your audio podcast should benefit the listener, and you should understand your target audience. Understanding your target audience helps in determining what your audience desires and keeps them coming back. This is about building relationships, which we will also talk about later. See your audience as a group of friends or an extended family by connecting with them and sharing the topic they desire. Most of the time, when someone dials into your podcast, they're looking for something. They're looking to attach to something. They're looking for a benefit. That's the primary aspect of audio podcast. Think about it. How many podcasts do you listen to? Why do you listen to it? Why do you stay engaged with it? This is about understanding your target audience. Connect with your topics. Well, with your topic. Always find an element of connection with your topic. Finding this connection will help in connecting the audience to the topic and the podcast. This is part of that building a relationship aspect of your podcast, your engagement. You have to think about it. What do you connect with on a daily basis that you devote a certain level of time to? Well, the average podcast may be 10 minutes or 20 minutes. Now, if you take that 20 minutes and put it to each day, what creates that relationship and what devotes your time to this element that you're listening to, i.e. this podcast in which we're talking about today. Connecting with your topics prevents boredom and provides interest for your audience. Now, once again, you are a member of the audience. If you connect to the topic, you can connect the audience to you and to the topic and to the podcast. Connecting your guests to the audience is the key in a good interview. And we will get to your guest. So your topic could be a story or content, and in this aspect also a guest, as we're talking about interviewing. Your podcast is a conversation. A lot of people don't really embrace a podcast like that. A podcast is a conversation with your audience, which provides the engagement. When it comes to interviewing, talk to your guest as if you're talking with friends or a friend. The conversation should entice the audience to join the conversation. Audio podcast is an element of social media where everybody wants to join into what's being shared or shown or heard. So imagine out being said at an outdoor gathering, and you hear a conversation that two people are having, and they're discussing a topic that you're connecting with. How many times have you heard someone talk about a particular topic that engages you and you want to actually join a conversation or you want to input? You might be two people talking and it turns to three, then it turns to four, and it turns to five. It's a conversation. So your podcast is really a conversation on the internet in the audible aspect. Your podcast is a conversation. You have invited the guest to the podcast. Let them talk. The guest is the highlight of the conversation. The conversation must be guided but not dominated by the host. Some podcasts you may listen to, the host tends to become either more than half of the conversation or more than half of the conversation, where they lose focus on the guest and they lose focus on its actual conversation or the topic thereof. Again, the guest is invited to the podcast. Let them talk. The guest is the highlight of the conversation, and the conversation must be guided but not dominated by the host. And as I said previously, your conversation should engage the audience. Engagement by the audience may become comments during the podcast, depending on where it's hosted at, or they may want to send a tweet, depending on your communication outlet to the podcast. But again, your guest is invited. The guest is the highlight of the conversation, not the host. The conversation must be guided, but not dominated by the host. It will take time when it is for you to feel when it is good to insert yourself into the conversation, but do it with a question. This is an aspect of good interviewing that you have to feel over time. You'll pick that up. It might be a cue of the guest or a pause in the conversation or what have you, but you have to learn the natural aspect of doing that. Information is key. Provide information in short but impactful stories or personal viewpoints. Whenever you have a conversation, at many times where a connection to the conversation or the topic or to prove your topic comes in a short story you're going to tell. Keep it short and keep your audience wanting more. When it comes to a podcast, repeat information provided and embrace it as if you're learning with the audience. Providing information is learning. Hence, the first point, provide information in short but impactful stories. That last point, repeat information provided. Information is learning. Now, we're going to get into the steps of a good interview. I gave you keys previously, aspect to think about, but here are some key steps in executing some of those keys to unlock the aspect of becoming this good interview host. First concept to take in is it's about the audience and the guest. Consider asking questions or consider questions your audience may ask. You're part of the audience. You're trying to engage the audience. What are you looking to ask, or what are your goals in keeping the audience engaged with your podcast? Remember, the duration of your podcast, you want to keep your audience throughout the duration and yet coming back for the next episode. So think like the audience member. What do you want your audience to get out of it? Establishing a personal connection with the guest also helps finding a new angle in the conversation or asking an original question. So if you are part of the audience and you connect with the guest, then your podcast will be a connecting conversation with you, the audience, and the guest, which will provide a good podcast, a great podcast. First step, a primary step, prepare opening questions. Ask the guest what questions they are asked the most. because these questions might be the crux of their presentations or their most engaging outlets that they have, which will lead to the opportunity of adding more questions and getting a deeper conversation. Also, the guests might have some points that they want the audience to know. The guests may have questions that really bring home daring or bring them closer to the conversation, which if you have an in-depth question, that connection with the guest and the audience will be easily made when you have that open and deep question. There are always viewpoints on a topic no one thinks about or knows. So if you have an opening question, this is before actually the show starts, you have this opening question, and this opening question will be a question that the guest always encounters. But as an audience member, you may hear that question and you may come up with an insight that the guest may not ever thought about, because the guest really is asking that opening question that they're asked all the time through their viewpoint and not necessarily the audience viewpoint. So if you hear it in the matter of fact, before you record the podcast, you address the question, you get the answer, and then all the time when the podcast starts, you might ask that question again, and when it starts and you're thinking about the audience at this point, you might have another thought based on that question, which enhances a great conversation or the start of a great conversation. Establish interview rules. There are rules of engagement during podcast interviews. Can include having the guests acknowledge when they have completed the answer to a question or a statement. Well, with that aspect, a lot of times you may listen to a podcast where the host may, quote unquote, step on the guest or not let the guest complete a full answer. Or the opposite could be the guest gives an answer and they completed the answer, but the host has not picked up on that key, so now engages again, where you might end up having a small pause or dead air. You might have a hiccup in the interview or disconnect. So you establish the rules that kind of maybe you rehearse the podcast before you actually record a good key. Good step. Informing guests of how the show duration and topics being discussed will help in ensuring all topics, i.e. angles, will be discussed. Now, with the topics, the audience are keyed into your podcast based on the engagement with the host or the connection with the host and the topic. So you want to make sure your topic is being addressed on the podcast. All views are shared and respected. Again, these are the interview rules of engagement. Respecting and sharing all views provides for an authentic conversation which engages the audience. Build relationships. As a host, you are a motivator. What are you motivating? Audience engagement, connection with the guest, and really the aspect of a great conversation. That's what you're motivating. As you build a relationship with the guest, you can motivate the engagement of your topic. One of the goals you might want to have, subliminal goals, is to want the audience for more information. Get the conversation so deep to say, okay, well, there's our time, but the audience want more. You want them coming back. Building relationships and conversations by sharing a personal aspect to break the ice. This is showing your vulnerability or your authenticity of the host, the transparency. You share that, you're not only sharing with the guest, but you're sharing with the audience, which provides that connection. Create a personal connection by rehearsing the question before recording an episode. And I kind of stated that earlier. This allows you and the guest to connect with the topic. Now, earlier, it was stated that you should connect with the topic. Now, at this point, when you build a relationship, you are connecting with the guest and the topic. And so the guest can is already connected to the topic. So now the guest can connect with you, which provides that authentic conversation, and the audience can pick that up, which creates that engagement for the audience, being part of that conversation. again, to reiterate this thought, being a good host or a good interviewer, it's about the audience and the guest. Your podcast is about the audience and the guest. So a few people out here creating podcasts will have a podcast with a name and then the host name subtitle, or they may have their name as the title of the show. Despite how you name the show, despite having your name on the show, it's all about you. It's all about the audience and you. That connection. It's all about the audience and the guest. It's all about the conversation. But primarily, it's about the audience and the guest, and you motivate that conversation, stated just the slide before, to engage for a good podcast or conversation, which establishes you as a good interviewer. Your audience engages the podcast for topic and guests. Do your research about your guests and develop thought-provoking questions. Avoid cookie cutter questions. Again, do your research, connect with the guest, connect with the topic, connect with your audience, your target audience. Once you determine your target audience, determining your target audience is also the connection with the audience. So you know how to talk to that audience, what draws them in. You already have a connection strategy, but now you got to do this through the conversation. Each podcast should have a goal. Your audience will always wonder what is in the show for them, i.e., social media. You have an emotional connection, mental connection, or what have you. So when they look at your podcast, they say, okay, what's in it for me? I'm getting ready to devote 20 minutes or 10 minutes or however long your podcast is of my day listening to this. What is this podcast going to provide me, or how will it benefit me? There should be a goal in discussing the topic for the guest, the audience, and the host. Again, as the host, you're learning with the audience. There should be a goal. What is your goal based on this topic and this guest? Setting goals for each episode helps in establishing a podcast your audience will connect and engage daily. Think about it. What element of social media or media do you engage in on a daily basis? Why do you watch it? What do you hope to gain from it after you engage with it for that day? Again, setting goals for each episode helps in establishing a podcast your audience will connect and engage daily. Now, again, from the beginning, an audio podcast. In this day and age, it's very easy to start a podcast, to grab a microphone, to have a device from your phone to your computer to software or what have you. It's very easy to do that. Creating or providing the conversation, being a good interviewer, engaging the guest, and etc. That is the difficult part. It takes certain steps in getting your audience engaged on a daily basis. Again, I am Fred Barrett with the PBS Western Reserve. I am the Emerging Media Learning and Development Manager. Along with the Ohio EdTech agencies, we are happy to support you on Digital Learning Day 2022. Thank you for watching.